some focusing problems. That's what's happening. So I got a Lexus 2008 es350. This car has a misfire, simply put. Not a very complicated job when it comes to just diagnosing these. And the good thing is this car is super intelligent. By being super intelligent, it's good at telling you what's wrong with it. The code that I'm addressing today was a P0, let's see, P0354. It was the ignition coil D, primary, secondary circuit. So it doesn't know specifically what's wrong with the coil. It just knows that there's a misfire detected. And likely what's happening, unlike a lot of other vehicles, this particular vehicle has an ignition coil F wire, IGF, and that confirmation takes all the signals from all the ignition coils and gets inputted into PCM, and the PCM can pretty much determine the position or the whereabouts of the discrepancy. Say. So you have to look up at an oscilloscope to figure out what's going on. But if you hook up the oscilloscope to this IGF wire, you'll be able to see a pattern of all 6 coils firing. I've done that before on these vehicles. It's pretty much neat layout, and you can pretty much determine what's going on with it. It's good in diagnosing it if you have an oscilloscope. So this has a ground. Typical ground, 12 volts, and a signal that tells it to fire, and an IGF, which determines if there's any type of discrepancy with that coil. So if there's some issues internally with that coil, the IGF is going to fall off, and then it will know that, hey, we got a problem with A or B, etc. How these coils are numbered, the banks on this vehicle, this is going to be bank 2 in the front, bank 1 is going to be in the back or the rear by the firewall. They're numbered in the odd or even bank. So what it is, everything in the rear is going to be odd, so that's 1, bank 1, so you got 1, 3, 5. Everything in the front here is going to be even, and you got 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, 6. So if you do it alphabetically, if alphabetically from beginning to end is sequential from A to F being 1 through 6, then the A, how would it go? 1 will be A, 2 will be B, 3 will be C, etc. all the way up to F. So you get your even, your odds. So B equals 2, A equals 1, C equals 3, so on. And that's how you would determine which coil is misfiring, such as this being a D, ignition coil D is misfiring. It's an odd. So A, B, C, D would, well, I'm sorry, it's an even. My bad. So D is an even number. Kind of threw me off because it's alphabetically. D is even. This is an even bank. And this is 2, 4, 6. So 4 is D. That's actually the one that's misfiring. So I swapped it with F being 6 and swapped it with D, and D is our issue. So we need some D. Alright, that sounds totally gay. So what we're going to probably could do a coil test, but I mean, like I said, this is extremely simple. Swap the coils, clear the code, see if the problem follows the cylinder, and it's pretty much cut and dry. I mean, there's nothing else we can really do. It's the most fastest, effective way of diagnosing the vehicle. So swap your parts first. Even if you swap the coils with no avail, you could, what you could do, swap the injectors. Take the fuel rail off, swap the injectors with 4 and 6, and see if the issue follows. If you don't have scan data, that would be the first thing I would do if I didn't have any type of resourceful information but a scan tool. But you could do a resistance value test, but an amp test is the most effective when you're doing these injectors here. And when diagnosing, you can look at the current ramp because of how resistance works with electrical components. You'll be able to see all that. So I'm gonna try to keep it basic, but I wanna show you some screenshots that I had. Well, we can look at the freeze frame data here once this get pulled up. So again, this is the code that came up this wasn't the conditions originally because I swapped the coil when initially diagnosing it. Again, it was on cylinder 6 and I moved it to 4, and as soon as I moved it to 4, it started having some issues. So if you look at freeze frame data, you'll have a list of parameters. These are PIDs, parameter IDs, and this gives you a snapshot of what the vehicle wound up seeing when it actually had an issue. So, which is a very useful bit of information when assessing or troubleshooting your vehicle. Let's see here. So I like to look up some basic stuff. I don't like to really go too terribly in depth. I don't care about the transmission shifting. I don't care about, well, let me see here. I don't really care about timing, especially like a misfire. But let's see here, the warm-up cycles, not too much so the purge valve may be important, but all this right here just kind of points you in the direction of giving you a story of what's going on. But I'm not going to worry about transmission issues when I got misfire conditions, unless there's like a shifting discrepancy, especially when my issues are present while stationary. But in this particular case, you have to weigh your situations. This tells me that when this misfire was determined, it saw that was a 39% calculated load value. Basically, I was beginning to accelerate or was at a 39% load. That's nothing significant, as 100% load the vehicle may be able to tolerate. Coolant temperature is 185 hours in closed loop. Short-term, long-term fuel trim is very important. The issue was on bank 2, and I want to tell you something very important about this car because it's so high-tech in comparison to some of the other ones. Like some of the Nissans I looked at, I was able to look at PID data when determining a misfire. This car has a sequential firing system for the injectors. So it'll disable the injectors to ensure that it does not burn out the catalytic converter or overload it with fuel, because when the coil goes bad, it's not firing. If you have an excessive fuel dump inside the combustion chamber, it's going to wind up going to the exhaust system, which will accumulate in the catalytic converter, which is a furnace, to burn off the noxious emissions. If you have more fuel, you start adding more fuel to the fire, which is going to cause it to burn up. I want to show you what that PID looks like, and I don't know if it came on, but it'll. There we go. So we got cylinder misfire. Let's see if the other one come up. There we go. Let's go to. Yeah, it didn't pop up on 5, but it was. I guess because of how the misfire was, it was real faint. It's CAT over OT over temp, and I guess MF is going to be malfunction, and FC is going to be fuel control, cylinder number 5 here. So basically, when the car determines that it's misfiring, it's going to shut that fuel system down. So it's going to be very difficult to look at the fuel trims and determine if this vehicle was misfiring or not. So even then, we had misfire. The misfire counter didn't go off. So I'm not sure what's up with that. Maybe it's because of the scan tool, maybe because of some other factors, but the misfire count didn't populate itself. But that's something you will want to go to, especially if you swap the coils. But in this particular case, this car had a misfire, and I was able to swap the coils, and it followed the system, and it pointed me right to the coil. If I change that part and that part don't work, I'm not going to overlook anything, just change that part out. So vacuum pump, evap system, all this is, like I say, telling me a story about what went on when it happened. I mean, this is very vital information, very vital. So don't forget to look at your freeze frame data. So this was fine, so I'm not going to worry about this ignition coil. We're going to reinstall that when we put everything back in place. This one over here is the one that's defective. And again, I simply just removed the coil, swapped it, and the problem followed. this thing. Let's take a look at the spark plugs. 5-8 socket right here. So we're going to check the gap of these plugs here. And simply put, the iridium plugs don't break down and degrade the same as a platinum or a copper plug do. So that's why I really don't break my neck over gapping these things. And I'll explain further. But the old ones are around 43 thousandths gap, and the new one is close to around 43 thousandths gap also. So these are not going to degrade or degrade as rapid as a let's see if I can get the focus, as a copper plug would. And these aren't that old, but in most cases I haven't seen an iridium plug worn out as much as a platinum or a copper or double platinum. Also, this is a very well running engine. The engine can make a humongous amount of accommodation when it comes to altering fuel trims. So gapping your plugs does change the fuel trims, but not so significant to where it's necessary to gap them, if that makes sense. And the car can make accommodations. That's why we got the long-term, short-term fuel trims. And the gap, unless the gap was literally probably around like 20 thousandths or 10 and barely firing, it's still going to ignite. It's still not going to make too much of a difference. How can I say this? Unless it was forced induction, I can understand. But this is a naturally aspirated vehicle, and any plug that you typically get that's brand new is going to be able to work appropriately and not have to gap them, especially iridium. So you just simply leave them alone. Like I said, these cars are able to make huge accommodations with the fuel trims. This car doesn't have a narrow band oxygen sensor to where the values are going to be narrow, therefore the compensation is going to be narrow also. So most of these vehicles that have iridium or a standard plug that don't require a gap, or that require a gap, most times you get them, you can just leave them alone unless there's just some defect. So it doesn't hurt to check them, but I don't change the gap when I install new plugs on these new vehicles with the iridium plugs. Oh man, that fell all the way down there. So what I'll do when I get these plugs replaced, we're going to look at the fuel trim and just probably compare it. I'll try to emulate the freeze frame data here when it detected a misfire. But the only thing we got to go off of was the bank that was working appropriately, which was bank 1, since 2 allegedly had the fault, even though 2 was making up a compensation of 3.9% fuel. It was adding 3.9% more fuel, which is still extremely good for the running condition of this vehicle and the age of it and its ability to compensate. So I'm going to try to emulate the RPM and the load there and take a screenshot and show you that, it doesn't make that much of a difference when you do install these plugs. The worst thing to say, let's see here, the plug is over there, it's gone. The best case scenario, if these plugs were bad, it'll probably bring it down a percent or two, like less than a percent or two, to lean it out. But I highly doubt it. you know, because the older plug technically should have made it richer. So it should have kind of took away from fuel. So maybe it may lean out, but the car, because of fuel efficiency, is going to run a little leaner, you know. So I guess it'll better compensate by adding more fuel than taking it away, which will determine the problem. So I'm not sure. We'll see what happens, but I don't think it's going to really be much once I get those plugs in there, if it's going to compensate at all. It's not going to make it run richer. The gap is the same. Technically, like I said, the older plug should have been more inefficient because of the accumulation of carbon and the potential for consolidation of a spark to try to jump a gap. So it should have made the spark plug more inefficient, I'd imagine. But the spark plug has a clean tip. It should burn more efficient, you know. So we'll see what happens once I get everything installed. This, like I said, this car is very intelligent, so I can't imagine it like being extremely imperative to gap the plugs on this car. Both of the, well, all three of the spark plugs changed in the front bank. I left the old ones in the back. And what I'm going to do, we're just going to simply compare both of the fuel trims and the data for both banks, and show you the difference between new spark plugs, ungapped, versus the old ones. And well, I'll show you why I really don't care too much about gapping iridium plugs. So if you look here at our lambda values, bank 2 was the one we changed the spark plugs on, and bank 1 is where the old ones still reside. If you know about lambda values, you want them closest to 1 as possible. These are right there at it, no issues. We can look at our calculated load, which is at idle. It's at 34%, 35%, just like the freeze frame data we just pulled up. And here, if you look at the cat temperature, right here for bank 1, sensor 1, bank 1, sensor 1, and bank 2 right here, you can see they're both right there with each other. We can look at our exhaust temperatures down here on bank 1 sensor 2 and bank 2 sensor 2. They're both right there with each other also. So there's, the main thing is when you change these gaps, you change the running conditions of the combustion chamber. So the closer the gap, the more richer it's going to run, theoretically. But like I was telling you, these cars, like this Lexus, is very intelligent and is capable of making these accommodations. If we go even further down here, we have our long-term fuel trims. Long-term fuel trim on 2 is at 3.1%, and they're both right there at 3.1%, and just fluctuating, you know, within a 0.8% or not. But we can see here on number 1, which wasn't changed, that is a little higher, which is technically a little richer. Well, I would say, well, it's adding 8%, so it's technically like, how would I say this? It's leaner. So it's making those accommodations by adding 4.6 or 3.8% fuel. So it's not, I mean, they're right there with each other. There's no issues. And here's our engine RPM here. So I mean, whether or not you gap them with these new cars, the running conditions are not really going to greatly vary. It only really applies to forced induction only under heavy loads. I'm gonna work on getting everything back together. I feel like I know I'm rambling. I know somebody's gonna say something about that. But I just kind of want to prove my case as far as like, why is it irrelevant just to put like the gap iridium spark plugs? I mean, like I said, they're not going to make too much of a difference. But I am kind of curious to see what happens if you put coppers in here or platinums, you know, if it changed the fuel trims. But again, the vehicle is totally capable of making those accommodations. I mean, so it's really hard to change the running conditions of these vehicles when they're so well put together now, and it's so efficient, fuel efficient. So I'm gonna put it that way. But if you're curious as far as how long it take to change the plugs on this vehicle, it's 2.4 hours labor time. That's the book time on it. But I'm pretty sure there's that guy who can do it in 30 minutes. But that's the book time on this. Well, other than that, I want to get off because I know I'm rambling. But other than that, hit that link, subscribe to the channel, stay informed, have that reassurance of my work. See you next one.